Welcome back to Wit and Wisdom, Module 3, Lesson 3. This is Mrs. Healy from Luttrell Elementary. Let's get started. Before we actually get into our lesson, you will need your response journal worksheet, a piece of paper and a pencil, your blue Module 3 workbook, and the digital copy of George versus George. Our learning goals for Lesson 3 are to write somebody wanted but so then statements to explain the perspectives and events which led to the Boston Massacre. And we also want to be able to write brief descriptions for each part of a painted essay on the template. And in our deep dive for today, we're going to complete a Freyer model for the word liberty, including the ways it is used in the text and related to American symbols. For our welcome task today, I want us to read the heading on page 18 of George versus George. And what do you notice about this heading? What do you think is going to happen next to the British or with the British and the colonists? And I want you to think about what you've learned so far about these two sides and their different perspectives. So let's look at page 18 of George versus George. Remember, we want to look at our actual page numbers and not this number up here. So page 18, and our heading is the trouble with taxes. So what do you think is going to happen? And what did you notice about this heading? Hopefully you noticed the dates, 1764 to 1770. So there's about a 6-year span of time that we're going to be talking about. When we are reading, headings often give us, as readers, clues about what is going to happen in the text. Now, in case you didn't remember from social studies, taxes are money that is paid to a government, which the government uses to keep itself running and to pay for the cost of providing services to the people. For example, many of the states in America, including Tennessee, have a sales tax on things that are bought. This sales tax can help pay for different services that people use, like roads or schools. And here's that timeline I showed you, or I talked about. So 1764, and I extended this one to 1771. Remember, our essential question for Module 3 is why is it important to understand all sides of a story? And our focusing question for this group of lessons is what were the perspectives of the two main sides of the American Revolution? And our content framing question for this lesson is what is happening on pages 18 through 22 of George versus George. Today you're going to read the text to find out what the trouble is with taxes and to gather more information about the perspectives of the colonists and the British. So let's read page 18. Remember, as I am reading, I want you to use your extra sheet of paper to jot down words that you don't understand, words that are unfamiliar or you're not quite sure what they mean, any questions that you have, or any observations. So let's hop over here to page 18. Okay. So what stirred up the hornet's nest in the first place? It all began over money, and over the rights of citizens too. Great Britain had been in one war or another for 50 years and was drowning in debt. Over in London, Parliament decided that Americans should help out by paying their fair share, and King George agreed. After all, Great Britain had spent plenty of money fighting in America for the good of the colonies. The Crown was still supporting a British army to help stop Indian attacks on the American frontier. It was Great Britain's right to collect payment. To raise money, Parliament passed a Sugar Act and a Stamp Act, saying that the colonists had to pay taxes to Great Britain for all sorts of imported goods, from molasses, blue indigo dye, and pimentos, to printed items such as marriage licenses, playing cards, and newspapers. Similar taxes were often collected in England. but colonists were already paying separate taxes to cover their own war debts and to run the colonies. A lot of them thought paying twice wasn't one bit fair. Besides, they believed it was against the British Constitution. Ever since the Middle Ages, English law had said that there should be no taxation without representation. This meant that citizens could never be taxed unless their elected representatives voted to pay. The colonists were British citizens, and the law guaranteed them the rights of Englishmen. So, where was their right to have representatives who could vote for or against these taxes? Though many colonists would stay loyal to the crown and obey its laws no matter what, others argued that Parliament might make them pay even more taxes without their consent. Were your predictions correct about what the problem was going to be involving taxes? Were you completely correct because you thought they were going to fight about having to pay taxes? Maybe you thought the British and the colonists might have different perspectives about the taxes? Or were you partially right? You knew that there would be conflict between the sides about taxes, but maybe you didn't realize it was because the British wanted to tax the colonists, and some of the colonists didn't think they should be. Or was your prediction not right because you thought both sides were going to be upset about having to pay taxes and that they might have similar perspectives about taxes? Before we move on, let's hop back over to page 18 and let's talk about this phrase, drowning in debt. When you have debt, it means that you owe something to someone, and it usually means money. And since Britain was drowning in debt, they owed a lot of money. So let's take a minute and think about, why did Parliament decide to pass the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act to have the colonists pay more taxes to Britain? And what was the British perspective about this? In just a moment, I want you to pause the video to answer these questions in your response journal. When you are writing your responses, I want you to make sure that you are quoting sections of the text in your responses. So you want to say, on page 18, this text stated, and then write your answer. Okay, pause the video to answer those two questions. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to complete handout 3A, which is a perspectives chart. So let's look at our directions up here. Review pages 18 through 22 of George versus George, the American Revolution as seen from both sides, and find evidence related to the different perspectives of the British and the colonists. Fill in the blanks and the missing words and citations related to the quotations. Think about how each perspective may lead to conflict between the two sides. Circle the words that indicate or relate to perspective, how someone sees something or thinks or feels about something. All right, so we're going to be doing page 18, and I want you to work with your learning coach, and I want you to complete the British column part 1. You will need to add the author's last name and page number in some instances. Those are your citations. Okay, pause the video and do just the British perspectives. Okay, let's check your work. Parliament decided that Americans should help out by paying their fair share. Great Britain had spent plenty of money fighting in America for the good of the colonies, and they thought it was Great Britain's right to collect payment. And that's from Shanzer, page 18. To raise money, Parliament passed a Sugar Act and a Stamp Act, saying that colonists had to pay taxes to Great Britain for all sorts of imported goods. And here's where we're going to do our citation. We're going to put Shanzer, and then we already have the page number 18. So how did the colonists feel about this? How was their perspective different from the British? Many colonies were angered by these taxes and felt they were being taxed twice. The colonists were already paying separate taxes to cover their own war debts and to run the colonies. A lot of them thought paying twice wasn't one bit fair. And again, we found that on page 18. They believed it was against the British Constitution. And though many colonists would stay loyal to the crown and obey its laws no matter what, others argued that Parliament might make them pay even more taxes without their consent. So generally, the colonists were not too happy about paying these taxes. Now you're going to independently complete the colonist perspectives column on handout 3A. Pause the video to complete this. Okay, let's check your work. The colonists were already paying separate taxes to cover their own war debts and to run the colonies. A lot of them thought paying twice wasn't one bit fair. And that's from Shanzer, page 18. In the box right below, they believed it was against the British Constitution. The colonists were British citizens, and the law guaranteed them the rights of Englishmen, which said no taxation without representation. And again, we want to put the author's last name, Shanzer. And then, though many colonists would stay loyal to the crown and obey its laws no matter what, others argued Parliament might make them pay even more taxes without their consent. And you should put Shanzer and 18 right there. So let's take a moment to think. What does no taxation without representation actually mean? How does it relate to this conflict? Let's find evidence in the text to support our answer. No taxation without representation means that citizens could never be taxed unless their elected representatives voted to pay, and that was on page 18. This had been English law since the Middle Ages. And the colonists were British citizens, and the law guaranteed them the rights of Englishmen, again on page 18. Now, let's look back at page 17. And here we have the upper house and lower house. And I have a different picture too. Okay. So the House of Commons, or the lower house, consisted of representatives elected by the colonists to help make decisions about taxes and other things. These representatives were not allowed to vote on the Sugar Act and Stamp Act, and this is why many colonists thought their rights were not being respected. So let's look at taxation without representation, and let's look at those words individually. And what does the suffix ION mean? And what do you remember about your study of the word revolution? The suffix ION means a condition or state of being. Revolution means in a state of change or turning over. So taxation means being in a state of being taxed, and representation means in a state of being represented. So what do you notice about the words in the speech bubbles at the bottom of the page? So we have Samuel Adams, who was an American patriot and an English poet. Samuel Adams said, "If our trade may be taxed, why not our lands and everything we possess or make use of?" And then the English poet said, "This Stamp Act, no doubt, may be good for the crown, but I fear 'tis a pill that will never go down." The speech bubbles show people talking about taxes. The people talking are on two different sides. Samuel Adams, who was speaking on the American side, and an English poet speaking on the British side. So, how are the words spoken in the speech bubbles different from the rest of the text on the page? So, let's take a look. So, we have these speech bubbles right here. Now, let's look at the rest of the text on here. Hopefully, you said that the words in the bubbles are more personal. The statements used words like I and our. They are being spoken by people who were actually there during these events. The rest of the text on the page is written by the author, and it is not as personal because the author was not there. So we want to make sure that we are looking out for more of these as we continue to read George versus George. Now, with your learning coach, I want you to read pages 19 through 22 and make sure you are jotting down notes you don't understand, observations, things that you notice, questions that you have. So pause the video to read pages 19. Let me zoom this out just a little bit so you can see. So page 19, 20, 21, and 22. Okay, pause the video. Now that you've had a chance to read pages 19 through 22, let's look at a couple words that you might have had some trouble with. On page 19, we had the word distributor, and that's someone that gives out something or they are providing a service for someone. And then we had infuriated on page 22, and that means to make extremely angry. And then enraged on page 22 as well. Again, that's another word to say that someone was very angry. So, what happened as a result of people having different perspectives on taxes? On page 19, it said that many colonial merchants refused to buy British goods. On page 20, it stated that groups of colonists, such as the Sons of Liberty, protested in the different ways by writing pamphlets, preaching against taxes, wrecking the home of the governor, burning the stamps, and flying flags at half-mast to, quote, mourn the death of liberty. On page 20, it said that nobody in America would even distribute the stamps, so they wouldn't give them out. On page 20, it said, 4 months later, hoping to restore peace, Parliament finally gave up and got rid of the hated taxes. This troubled King George, who still thought the taxes were fair, but he signed the repeal anyway. And also on page 20, the text stated, British merchants were delighted to get their lost customers back, and all of America celebrated. Why didn't the conflict end when the Sugar Act and Stamp Act were repealed? How did the colonists react? On page 20, we read that to show they weren't afraid to tax the colonists, Parliament started demanding even more taxes. Also on page 20, it said, Patriot leaders made polite protest to the king, but politeness didn't help one bit. Now, what is divine right, and how did it affect the perspective of King George and the people of Great Britain? On page 21, it states that King George believed that God gave noblemen the divine right to rule, and that the colonists had a duty to obey. So, divine right means that the kings and noblemen get their power from God and from no one else, is what they believed. And the British told the colonists to stop meeting and trying to protest because they thought the colonists had to obey the king no matter what. What did the colonists do next? And how were the Daughters of Liberty involved? On page 21, we read that colonists smuggled in untaxed goods from other countries, which was illegal. They also made a lot of their own goods instead of buying British ones. And on page 21, the Daughters of Liberty supported the cause by weaving their own cloth, making their own ball gowns, and brewing their own Liberty tea. So, what was King George's perspective on the colonists and their actions? What did he do next? How did all of these things eventually lead to a conflict in Boston? On page 22, it stated that King George was sure that gentlemen who pretended to be patriots in Massachusetts were no more than criminals, so he sent a fleet of warships to Boston to make them behave. 700 British soldiers showed up in Boston and started doing things that bothered the colonists. On page 22, the text stated, in March 1770, an angry mob of American rowdies started taunting 8 of King George's soldiers and pelting them with snowy or icy snowballs. Then someone threw a lump of wood at a redcoat and knocked him flat. The enraged troops began firing into the crowd, and 5 colonists were killed, and that was on page 22. And finally, also on page 22, furious Sons of Liberty were quick to label the disaster the Boston Massacre, and it stirred up plenty of anger on both sides. Now I want you to complete part 2 of handout 3A. Remember, you will need to add the author's name and page number in some instances and follow the examples that are already completed. I want you to understand that at times it may be difficult to distinguish between perspectives as the way someone feels or thinks about something and the decisions or actions which result from that perspective. In some cases, both are listed in the perspective charts because they are so closely related. Pause the video to complete part 2 of handout 3A. We will learn more about this terrible event and the word massacre in lesson 4. So let's look back at our timeline that we had. You will see in 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. And then the very next year, in 1765, they passed the Stamp Act. But the Boston Massacre didn't happen until 1770. So these events took place over a period of several years, and it took some time for the differing perspectives to build up to that conflict in Boston. All right, we're going to switch gears and focus on distinguishing first-hand and second-hand accounts. So I have these quotations for you. We have, these are no sons of liberty, these are sons of violence. And the second one, I am more and more grieved at the accounts of America. It is undoubtedly the most serious matter that ever came before Parliament. The third one, I dare tax America. I will. The fourth one, fire. By God, I'll stand by you whilst I have a drop of blood. The fifth one, you coward, you dare not fire. And then finally, you can't kill us all. So who is speaking in each one of these quotes? Well, if we go back to the text, we will find out that On page 19, the royal officer who's being tarred and feathered by the Sons of Liberty said that these are no sons of liberty, these are sons of violence. All right, King George on page 19 said that he is more and more grieved at the accounts of America. And then Charles Townshend, Treasurer of Parliament, said, I dare tax America. I will, I will. And then finally, different colonists all said those last quotes. So, how are these parts of the text different from the rest? These are quotations of actual people who were there during this time period. They were there in the 1700s. They are more personal, and they use some words like I, us, and you. And these statements show how different perspectives in a more personal way. So these words were spoken by real people who were actually present during these events. These are called first-hand accounts and are historical words which have been witnessed and recorded. Second-hand accounts are words written by people who were not present at the event, but who have researched the information about the event from witnesses and who were there. Aside from the quotations in the speech bubbles, the book, George versus George, is a second-hand account. So first-hand accounts are people that were there and their words were recorded. And then George versus George is a second-hand account because it's been researched and written about by someone who was not there. So why do you think an author would choose to include first-hand quotations? First-hand quotations show what people who were actually there really thought and what they said. They provide more reasons and evidence about why people had certain perspectives and did certain things. So how does this help support the statement at the beginning of George versus George that there are, quote, two sides to every story? This helps support the author's statement about two sides of a story because the person who had something to say adds information about the different sides and different perspectives. In your vocabulary journal, we need to add these words: firsthand, secondhand, and liberty. All right, firsthand means from the original source, direct, or a synonym would be a primary source. Secondhand is not from the original source. It's an indirect, and it's also known as a secondary source. And then finally, we have the word liberty, which means freedom from being controlled, the right to choose or act freely. And some synonyms would be independence or freedom. Pause the video to add these words and definitions to your vocabulary journal. All right, so we're going to switch gears to writing now. And you have been reading and noting evidence about the perspectives of the colonists and British in order to write an explanatory essay. You're going to use the painted essay format to organize your writing. Here's what you will be writing on. Remember, our painted essay, we're going to have our introduction. We're going to have our thesis or focus statement. We're going to have one point to support our thesis or our focus statement. A second point. We're going to have evidence and reasons to support our point one. And we're going to have a transition and then evidence and reasons to support our point two. And then we're going to restate our focus statement in our conclusion. So let's look at our focusing question task. Write an explanatory essay to respond to the following prompt. What were the perspectives of the two sides of the American Revolution? Use evidence from at least two sources in your essay. So, what is the purpose of explanatory writing? Explanatory writing is used to explain something and to provide information about a topic. So in your response journal, you have this T-chart because we want to compare explanatory writing to opinion writing. So explanatory writing explains something. It provides information about a topic. It includes a focus statement or thesis and supporting points in the introduction about the topic. It uses supporting evidence in the middle paragraphs to support the focus statement and to link the supporting statements. And finally, it includes a conclusion which repeats the focus statement or thesis in a different way and wraps up the essay with a reflection about the topic. Remember, a thesis statement and a focus statement are all the same thing. They're just called different people call them different things. And we're going to learn more about opinion writing later on. So pause the video and complete this chart in your response journal. Now I want you to study the painted essay template and discuss how each section would relate to writing an explanatory essay about the perspectives of the two main sides of the American Revolution. Write brief descriptions in your response journal to describe the content for each part of the template. Pause the video to write down your descriptions. Now that you've had a chance to jot down your descriptions, let's remember how we used our painted essay in Module 1. Remember, the purpose of the introduction was to provide context for the reader, to explain what the essay was going to be about, and to get the reader's attention. The first paragraph would include a thesis or focus statement about the two main sides of the American Revolution, the British and the colonists, and a supporting point about each side. The purpose of the second paragraph would be to provide evidence of the perspective of the first side. The purpose of the third paragraph, or proof paragraph 2, would be to provide evidence and perspectives of the second side. And then the purpose of the last paragraph, or conclusion, would be to restate the focus statement about the perspectives of the two sides in a different way and to wrap up the essay by reflecting on the information. All right, in order to prepare for writing this essay, you will be completing or compiling information in an evidence organizer in the next lesson. So let's revisit our content framing question for today. What is happening on pages 18 through 22 of George versus George? Remember, we wanted to write somebody wanted but so then statements. So we could say the somebody was the British. They wanted to tax the colonies more to help pay for war debts, so they passed the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. But the colonists felt it was unfair to pay taxes twice without representation. So the colonists protested. When their protests were not heard, they stopped buying goods from England and started smuggling and making their own. Then King George sent soldiers to Boston to make the colonists behave, and the conflict became worse, resulting in the Boston Massacre. Now, remember, we use this chart to summarize what is happening in the text and how certain events led to others through cause and effect. So now I want you to write your own somebody wanted but so then statements to summarize the perspectives and events on page 22. Begin your chart by using the colonist as the somebody. Pause the video to complete this chart and your summary statement. All right, to wrap up our lesson for today, for tonight for homework, you need to be practicing your fluency for handout 1B, and you're going to be practicing reading with appropriate expression. Remember, we are not robots. We want to make sure that we have different changes in our voice when we are reading. And now it's time to hop into our deep dive, which is going to focus on vocabulary. So what do you already know about the word liberty? We had it in our lesson earlier today. And what are some synonyms of liberty? or words that have similar meanings. So remember, we read the word liberty in George versus George and recorded it in our vocabulary journals. And it meant freedom from being controlled or the right to choose or act freely. We read about the colonists making Liberty tea. We read about the sons and daughters of liberty. I've heard about the Statue of Liberty in New York, or you may have heard about the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And you may have heard the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the Declaration of Independence. Now, with your learning coach, I want you to locate all of the uses of the word liberty on pages 19 through 22 of George versus George. You can either mark these with a sticky note or you can jot these down on your blank piece of paper. Pause the video to locate all the uses of the word liberty. All right, let's see how you did. On page 19, it said, angry members of an organization called the Sons of Liberty stripped the royal office holders naked and covered them with hot tar and goose feathers. On page 19, in the speech bubble, it said, these are no Sons of Liberty, they are sons of violence. On page 20, it said, by the time the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect in November of 1765, flags were being flown at half-mast to mourn the death of liberty. On page 21, it said, a women's group called the Daughters of Liberty supported the cause by weaving their own cloth, making their own ball gowns, and brewing their own Liberty tea out of sassafras flowers. And then on page 22, it said, furious Sons of Liberty were quick to label this disaster the Boston Massacre, and it stirred up plenty of anger on both sides. So how is the word liberty used differently in each of these sentences? How does the meaning of the word contribute to the sentences and to the story you are reading about the American Revolution? So some of the colonists used the word liberty as part of their name, like the Sons of Liberty or the Daughters of Liberty. This shows that the idea of liberty or freedom was very important to them, like a mother or a father. The text also talks about liberty as if it were something that was alive and then died. The colonists felt their freedom was being killed by the acts of the British. The author talks about Liberty tea, which is odd because you can't really make tea out of liberty. You can't really make a tea to drink out of freedom. But the colonists probably called it that because it was an important thing for them to make so they didn't have to buy tea from England and pay taxes on it. The tea became a symbol for their freedom from England. And then one name for the war between the colonists and the British is the War of Independence, which is like the War of Liberty. The colonists were fighting for the freedom to be their own country. Now, what are some antonyms or opposites of liberty? We could say bondage, we could say slavery, or imprisonment. All of those are the opposite of liberty or freedom. Now we have two very important symbols of liberty in America. The one on the left is the Statue of Liberty in New York City, and it is the first thing that people see when they are sailing into New York Harbor. The one on the right is the Liberty Bell located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it is in a building beside Independence Hall. You can see Independence Hall right behind it. So why do you think the word liberty is used for American symbols such as the Statue of Liberty and the Liberty Bell? Pause the video to jot down your answer in your response journal. Hopefully you said the word liberty is used because it means freedom. The Statue of Liberty represents the freedom of the United States, which many people seek when coming here. The Liberty Bell and Independence Hall are also names which point to the freedom of America. Now, because the word liberty is an abstract noun, so it's not something we can touch, it can be used in many different ways. It's an ideal, like the words love and happiness. And like its synonyms, freedom and independence, it is not. Because the word liberty is an abstract noun, it can be used in many different ways. It is an ideal, like the words love or happiness. And so it's not a concrete noun, so it's not something we can touch. When the colonists called themselves the Daughters of Liberty or Sons of Liberty, and made tea called Liberty Tea, they were using themselves and the tea as symbols of this word and its meaning. The colonists could have called themselves the Sons and Daughters of Freedom, or they could have made Independence Tea. These would have all had a similar meaning and would represent liberty the colonists were seeking. So in just a moment, I want you to pause the video and use what you've learned from the text George versus George about the American symbols to complete the Freyer model for the word liberty. You're going to put in the definition right here. What are characteristics of liberty? What are some examples of the word liberty? And what are some non-examples? Pause the video to complete the Freyer model. And with that, we are done with lesson 3. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you back here for the next lesson.